Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tamara Thorpe, and we're here for the podcast for Making Connections, a handbook for effective formal mentoring programs in academia. I am very excited to be here today with Dion Kleba, who is the author of case study number 1 in chapter 18, the well-prepared adjunct peer mentoring, autonomy supports, and values-based pedagogy. I'm extremely excited and so honored that Dion is here today because of the incredible care she gives to her work. Dion or Dr. Dion or Dr. Kleba is a human development specialist who designs engaging curriculum and professional learning environments for deep learning and transfer. She now consults in K through 12 and higher education. She's developed faculty peer mentoring programs that we're going to talk about today, developed the resiliency bridge, co-developed the human learning system instructional framework, and authors professional learning for faculty mentoring, K through 12 compliance, and STEM sports curriculum. So we are here with a real expert who is learner-centered, human-centered. So hello, Dion. Hello and welcome.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I appreciate this opportunity.
Well, I am really looking forward to hearing from you about the case study and the incredible work that you did. So can you tell us what inspired the work that you did, and in particular, the mentoring program in your case study?
The mentoring program that is described in the case study was conducted at Pacific Oaks College, the Northern California campus, a satellite campus. That program began in 2014 and it ended right before the pandemic, 2020, 2021. We had a little bit still going. I have a background in therapy and music therapy. I also have a degree in organization development. I'm a performing musician, and my doctorate's in learning and instruction. And there's something really magical about the overlap between all of those spaces, and that is that I really care about the quality of life. I care about other people's quality of life, and I care very much that people have an opportunity to bring the quality of their life as high as possible so that they can act on their passions and their desires, whether they want to work or serve the community, however that happens to go down for them. So I'm essentially positioned in I think a unique way from what I'm finding out to grow humans. I've always cared about that. I've always cared to somehow improve people's quality of life so that we have strong communities. I really just definitely care about that. So in this mentoring program, which was the first mentoring program that I designed, I used a combination of relational and resource-based practices to provide insight and guidance for others as I was developing the program. And I really wanted the mentors and the mentees to participate in a way that worked for them, so that they could realize their potential and so that they could mentor in a way that worked for them. So there's no one size fits all. And also for the mentees to find their own footing as a mentee. Because in our model, there was an adjunct faculty mentor. There was a pre-service adjunct faculty mentee who was practicing teaching in the classroom as a co-provider of education in the classroom with the adjunct faculty member. So it was a situated learning environment or a situated mentoring environment.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you. And I'm gonna just ask, because on one hand, it might seem obvious, but what is the connection between mentoring and really caring about humans?
Well, I think if we were to have a Venn diagram, the overlap would be huge. It would be huge. I think that to care about people is required to be an effective mentor. Mentoring is not a transaction. It's not, I'm going to give you something and you're going to go do it. That is not what mentoring is. Mentoring is, we get to know each other and build a trusting relationship. We share our funds of knowledge with each other. And soon it becomes clear to the mentee how that mentor can help them get where they want to go. And it becomes clear to the mentor the style in which they need to provide information. Is this a faster pace, a slower pace, to work with their mentee? So it's very personalized and really based on a sense of knowing each other, knowing thyself as a mentor and a mentee, and knowing each other. So there's got to be time built into the relationship at the beginning for that relationship to grow.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think on one hand, it's stating the obvious, and on the other hand, you and I both know from having overseen mentoring programs that sometimes a mentor might not have the level of care necessary to really build that effective mentoring relationship. And that's how we end up seeing, mentoring relationships that are not successful. So that's such a key part of that. Now, in your case study, you talk about applying autonomy supportive instruction, or ASI, which in your other chapter that you contributed to, you go into in depth. But I'm wondering if you could just share with us in terms of, we have folks in the audience who are administrators or program managers, coordinators, who are probably in some early stage or mid stage of a program. And what does having that kind of structure, if you think about your chapter, your case study, what are some things you want people to take from it in terms of thinking about this ASI model that you've used and having a model to build a program out?
Yeah, thank you for that. Autonomy supportive instruction is one way to enact self-determination theory. So the theoretical frame on which all of my work, my teaching, my facilitation, my instructional design, mentoring program design, all of it is based and grounded in self-determination theory, also coming from a constructivist approach, right? A learning-centered approach. And so autonomy supportive mentoring is actually a new arena. There's nobody else doing it. I found out with a bit of a shock. And so here we are. So thank you for asking that question, because here we are. So autonomy supportive mentoring means that the mentor is skilled in autonomy supportive instructional strategies. There are 6 strategies within that are laid out in the earlier chapter, not the case study necessarily. And those strategies are enacted intentionally, not only to grow the mentee's skills and development, but also to model a particular way of interaction and facilitating learning that can then be replicated. So the mentor learns how to become a mentor by my or the other program managers' use of autonomy supportive mentoring. So they've experienced the depth of engagement. They've experienced their volition being activated. They've experienced their intrinsic motivation and their self-directedness to be activated and encouraged. And there's very specific strategies that can be applied at different times as needed for all of that. But when a person experiences that as a learner, they then have a way to turn that around as a facilitator of learning with a depth of knowledge and some nuances that you're not going to get otherwise. Because how could you? This is not a transaction, this is a relationship. So it needs to have some time for the mentors to be able to process and find their own footing with autonomy supports. They're not going to do it right away. It doesn't mean say it this way or do it that way. That's not what it's about. There's intentional strategies that are intended to have particular outcomes for building engagement, for building competence, for building relatedness through the use of supporting a person's autonomy. So plenty of voice and choice for both the mentor in their role and the mentee in their role.
Thank you for that. And so I'm imagining as folks are listening that folks are thinking, what does this look like practically, right? What does that mean in terms of what are we asking from our mentors and mentees in terms of structure, training, time? What kind structure, time, and commitments are we talking about?
Well, in in the way of autonomy supportive spaces and self-determined spaces, there are structures put into place that provide a space in which the mentor-mentee relationship will form and grow and prosper. And the mentor or the program manager who is overseeing all of this doesn't have a whole lot of strings attached. There's enough structure so that the mentor and the mentee have a framework to work from. And I can explain that a little bit practically, but it doesn't lock anybody in. Locking somebody in basically says, I know what you should do and you don't. That's not what we do in mentoring. That does not respect another person's funds of knowledge. It doesn't respect their diversity, and it certainly doesn't respect what they think they might want to try. So it's very guidance oriented. It's very suggestion oriented. So for example, in the mentoring training, so we have a training and then there was an orientation. And in the training, the mentors learned about these strategies, but then we had a lot of conversation and role play and dialogue around what does this look like for you in your classroom? How do you already do some of this? And how can you do that with more intention for very specific outcomes of engagement and competence development in your students? So here we're replacing the mentee, we're replacing the student with the mentee. So, dear mentor, how can you use these 6 constructs to promote the engagement and the competence and the autonomy of your mentee so that they are engaged in their role and engaged in their own learning process of becoming a well-prepared faculty member over time?
Thank you for that. And as I was reading through the case study and your work earlier in the book, I am really struck by that centering of the mentee and their experience. And I have heard, we chatted earlier about how very often it can be very daunting to be a mentor, and mentors often feel the pressure of having to have all the wisdom and to know what to say and know what to do and to be able to, as you said, transact, give answers. But what you're talking about isn't about a mentor having all the answers,
No.
right? But centering that experience of the mentee. So is that what makes for a great mentoring relationship?
I think it's part of it, because what you're talking about, as I hear you, is this give and take. The mentor doesn't have to be an expert in something. A mentor has their own network that they can draw on to deepen their funds of knowledge, which then they can provide or create a connection for their mentee or with their mentee. So one of the things that's really important in an autonomy supportive mentoring environment is how matching happens. They are not matched by someone else. They match themselves. And so there's a lot of psychosocial elements that go on when they meet each other for the first time in a training environment. It's an orientation environment where they're learning the basics of autonomy supportive mentoring. They're learning about the structures of the program for each of the first semester and the second semester. They're learning about their role. They're learning about the expectations. And then there are some activities that are semi-structured in which I facilitate people to meet and greet each other, to have opportunities. They've already introduced themselves, talked about their goals and their dreams and desires, why they even care to be a faculty member in the first place. So we have a bit of a foundation for each person hearing from each other. And you know how it is when you go to a conference roundtable and people are introducing themselves, you can tell who you kind of connect with and resonate with. And you can also tell who you probably just, you might bump into them later and say hello, but there's not that connection. So what we want is to provide time and space for that connection to happen. And then there's also time and space to have a series of one-on-one conversations where they essentially do like a station rotation, speed dating, whatever you want to call it, where they get a chance to talk. Every mentor talks with every mentee. And at the end, they self-select. And it has always worked out
Yeah,
magically.
thank you for that. I think it's interesting because there's another case study that's in the book that offers this concept and methodology of self-selection, and I find it so fascinating because often the idea of matching can feel very daunting to a program coordinator or a program
Yes.
manager. And what criteria am I going to use, and what do I do when it doesn't work? And so what have you seen as the real benefits of that self-selection and the sustainability of a mentoring relationship?
Absolutely. So when people pick each other, they already are attracted to each other. There's something that they are interested in about each other. That's the very first construct in autonomy supportive instruction, is to be genuinely interested in your learners. So that's already that's already a foundation for the relationship, is that natural genuine interest, that natural genuine connection. From there, it's easy to care about each other because there's an interest, there's a willingness to engage, there's a willingness to share yourself with someone and share some stories, talk about what's important to you, talk about what your foibles are, all those kinds of things that happen as the relationship grows and trust is built. But what also happens is that when the relationship starts out that way, there's an interest differently for the mentee to really observe the mentor in practice. And again, in this first program, in this case study, it was to develop the mentee's skills for teaching in a values-based pedagogy with underserved adult, primarily women, in an education sector. So, and many of these women were multilingual, many had, sporadic education as they were going along. These are the students now in the program. And so as the mentee observes the mentor teaching and collects their own examples of autonomy supportive teaching, the mentor also is observing the mentee collecting the same examples of the same strategies. And then after teaching, when they engage in reflective practice conversations, they share the news. They share their observations with each other. And in so doing, they are sharing their practice of teaching with each other. And they are naturally improving their practice through dialogue and through turning ideas over, always staying within that framework of autonomy supportive instruction. That's their theoretical grounding. And then also tangentially to that, the values-based pedagogy that university uses.
Thank you for that. So one of the things that comes up for me is affinity bias, right? I certainly know when I find myself in environments, and bias exists, we all have it. Very often it serves us in a positive way, and we know in systems and institutions it can end up serving us in a negative way. And so I'm curious, from your experience, as you have seen, right, as this program played out for many years, did the good outweigh the potential bad, right? So that when we think about, because I'm constantly aware of my own affinity bias, and I'm very drawn to people who are just like me. And very often there are benefits from learning from people who are very different from ourselves. And so how does that factor in?
So it's not just whether they like each other. It also has to do with how do they communicate? What are their preferred communication modalities? Are they in-person people? Are they telephone people? Are they virtual in some way? Webinar, GoToMeeting, whatever it happens to be, right? So there's communication systems. There's also time. How much time do they each have to devote to this? There's structures that are set up for observation during their 6 teaching days in which they are observing each other. Those are required. But in between, they also have a required planning meeting and a required reflective practice meeting. So in having their speed dating conversations, part of what they're talking about and they're sharing their communication preferences, they're sharing where they live or where they work or how they work. So there's a lot of variety of types of information that you get about each of the people. And each cohort in this model, because it was a small satellite campus, was 4 mentors and 4 mentees at any given time. That was the largest that it got because it was a small campus. We didn't need to have any more than that. So that smallness, I think, made it easier. And I think that it is scalable, but we would have to be sure to scale it in a way that fits the culture of the university. And I don't know any examples I can share about that because every university has got its own approach to that. So that's one of the areas where in my work we really tailor that matching process if it's not done in a systematic way or if it's not done in a other selected way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's very thoughtful and very practical element of the work that you've done. And so taking in the environment, the situation that this case study sits, or you're at a relatively small campus with some non-traditional learners that come from diverse backgrounds, diverse educational backgrounds. What were some of the impacts we saw of this mentoring program?
You know, the faculty who self-selected, the adjunct faculty who self-selected to become mentors, really wanted to grow the professoriate. They cared to have colleagues who really wanted to teach at Pacific Oaks using a values-based pedagogy. And they wanted to have impact on that, they themselves. And some of those mentor faculty were alumni of Pacific Oaks and others were not. They were all well-prepared adjuncts. They were all very skilled, very responsible adjuncts who had availability and interest to serve the college in that way. But they also, almost all of them taught, as adjuncts do, in multiple institutions. So some of the outcomes were that because of how they taught, if other people saw them, they wanted to know, can I learn how to teach like that too? And they're like, yeah, come on down to Pacific Oaks. We've got a mentoring program. All you have to do is apply. So the relationships that are built, again, you hear how much self-selection and how much personal choice there is in that. We did have an interview process, absolutely. It's not just anybody. We also had a long wait list. So you know, we had to work through things. But I think that when adjunct faculty are well prepared to be members, contributing members of the professoriate to any institution, they are valued by an administrator. Those are the adjunct faculty that show up for training, that show up to put in for a grant or want to be a co-PI on a grant. Those are more engaged because they have relational experiences and because they want to contribute.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think so much of your approach and so deeply embedded in this program is autonomy, self-determination, and self-directedness, which I think really is what mentoring is in its essence, right? It's two people opting into that learning relationship that can be so impactful. And so I really appreciated how you have articulated that. So if I'm someone who is looking to build a program, what advice would you give if I am doing this for the first time? I've read through your chapter and case study, and it's a lot, but I may not on my first go be able to do this as deeply as you did. So what advice would you have?
Well, there's a couple of things that I always do. And I think mentors don't give advice, but you're asking for advice. So I'm going to give you guidance because that's what mentors do. So I would guide you or guide any new program manager to begin with the end in mind. Stephen Covey, one of those 7 habits for highly effective people. What is it that you want your mentoring program to provide? What do you want it to give mentors? What do you want it to give mentees? And who ultimately benefits? So often in faculty developed mentoring program, the students are forgotten. They're the recipients. They're a metric, right? If you have high quality instruction and deep learning and far transfer for your students, because you're using high impact practices and you have strong faculty relationships with students and with the content and investment of the faculty, whether they're adjunct or seasonal lecturers or tenured faculty, then you have students who are going to ultimately benefit by finishing their degree. You will have faculty who will stay. They will work toward their tenure and promotion if the campus provides that, or they will stick around because there's a growth trajectory for them within the field of being an excellent facilitator of learning. So that's one thing that I would definitely say is begin with the end in mind, and please be aware of who are the ultimate recipients. That's just really, really important. And second, I would say that it's really important to be collaborative, to come to the table that you are not the only one. You don't have to know everything. You don't even have to know how it's going to go down, but you do want to be open to how can we do this the best for starting out. Pick something quite small to start out, a program with 3 mentors and 3 mentees. It's really valuable to start small. And the last thing that I would say is that you want to build in your assessment protocol from the beginning. You want to have a protocol for program assessment and continuous improvement. You want to have a protocol for mentor assessment, whether they're including their self-assessment as well as their assessment of the program and their articulation of their experience. And you want to have the same opportunity for the mentee and for the program manager. And so when you create an assessment protocol that is inclusive, that has all of those perspectives, then you have a really strong recipe for continuous collaboration for program improvement. And no one person is responsible for it. It's collective. And it's always better because of multiple perspectives and multiple voices.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. That's incredible guidance, incredible guidance. And so imagine I take the guidance, but I have limitations of what I am able to do as a program coordinator or manager. So what is something that, regardless of resources, a must-have for moving forward with a program?
Do you want to have a successful long program? Do you want to have a short-term program? Because my answer would change.
Let's put it in the context of I'm starting a program. It's a pilot with the hope that it becomes something sustainable over time.
Do you have funding or not yet?
I have a little bit of funding.
Kind of that nice funding from your dean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure, you can do that. Here's $3,000. Yeah, so definitely begin with the end in mind. Definitely have an assessment protocol and a research question.
Okay.
The data become the research, right? That's your research project. You have that pilot, you've got data, you present at the Mentoring Institute, at least. You write it up, right? You publish on it and you get input on it. And you reach out and you find out how other institutions or other types of programs like yours are doing it. But if you begin with the end in mind, you have a strong assessment protocol, and that protocol yields data that can be published or expressed in some way, you have something that you can then sustain because you have a foundation on which to build.
Right. And even if I was in, not in higher ed, if I was in an organization, a business, that same applies, right? Because that gives that
Mhm.
foundation for me to go back and ask for more money, more resources, more time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're working in a nonprofit and you want to grow your volunteer base, start a mentoring program to grow the volunteer base, to have longer term volunteers, or whatever your outcome is,
Wow.
right? Whatever your end in mind is.
Yeah.
You have lots of opportunities across all sectors. There's conferences in every sector.
Correct.
There's chambers of commerce that need guest speakers. There's
Right.
community organizations, there's funding organizations, there's spaces for all organizations to talk about what they do and how things worked out and what they did well.
Yeah, and I think that's such great advice, because so often folks don't start with the end in mind, and they don't think about how to capture that data. And I know in my work as a consultant, we try to get folks to start with the end in mind. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want the outcome to be? Because folks tend to overemphasize the methodology and want to dive into it.
Well,
But
that's the
that
fun part.
becomes, it's the fun part for sure, but it certainly becomes, creates experiences where people get to the end of something and they have no data capture.
That's right.
They don't have any findings, and then they have no way to get additional resources, or, as you have shared, to amplify the work that they have done, to develop those partnerships, increase their knowledge, and share what they've done. So I love that. What would you see as something that is a nice to have?
A nice to have would be the support of someone in the organization who has the capacity to promote the program. So maybe that's a director level, maybe that's a dean or a VP level in an academic environment. Maybe that's, a CEO or a founder or something like that in a nonprofit. So when the mentoring program manager or developer designer has that person's ear, then what they can do, what I think they should do, is build a relationship that includes that person, so that that person is aware of what's working. Is maybe they have suggestions or guidance. Maybe they'd like to come in and observe. Maybe there's a pet project or something that there's a direction for. Any way to create those connections is going to be very, very valuable. It doesn't have to happen, but it's very nice when it does.
Excellent. And what could you live without?
Money. I ran that first program. The mentees and the mentors were not given any stipends. It was a purely volunteer program. So that shows the value of an autonomy supportive environment. They were there of their own volition, their own motivation, their own goals, and they were not given a reward of any kind. Now we have published, I have another chapter in press in another publication on reciprocal mentoring, which is an element of that program. And so, there's a lot of opportunities for the mentors and the mentees from that program to advance themselves. But I think that you can do it. I don't want administrators to know that that's the only way, though. I think that people deserve to be acknowledged. I did have tangential, not funding, but I did have a lot of support from my administration, for which I'm extremely grateful. I wouldn't be here without that initial support, because the program wouldn't have gone anywhere without that support.
Yeah, so absolutely, right. We definitely don't want anyone to be think that they can't get started without the money, but we also want decision makers to know that investment makes a difference.
Yes, it does.
Yeah,
it does.
Well, Dion, I cannot tell you how much I have enjoyed our conversation today. I was so impressed by the case study and the tremendous work that was done over a decade of really thoughtful people contributing to the support and development of other professionals and learners. And I am warmed by that human-centeredness and learner-centeredness in your work.
Thank
I'm
you.
looking forward to people reading the case study. And more importantly, I'm looking forward to people reading your earlier chapter and listening to that conversation. So if you have not already listened to that conversation on Dion's chapter, which I believe is chapter 11, then I invite folks to join us. Actually, no, yes, it's chapter 11, Preparing the Effective Mentee. So
Yeah.
if you have not heard our conversation on that, please go ahead, find your way there and listen to that conversation, because that is another phenomenal contribution and a really reflection of centering the mentor and the mentor's experience that I just found, as somebody who equally cares about humans and the mentor and the mentoring relationship, I found incredibly impactful. So please go ahead and take a look at the case study. And thank you all so much for joining us for today's conversation. And thank you, Dion.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I really, really have enjoyed the interview and the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.